Hello, everyone. My name is Katja Donovan, and I'm the Executive Director at 1014. Together with our partner, the De Gruyter Foundation, I welcome you to today's conversation in our transatlantic series, Humanities for Humans. In this series, prominent experts from various academic fields engage in discussions on the most pressing topics of our time. We all face significant challenges, regardless of our region or continent. The humanities, due to their ability to bridge cultural, regional, and disciplinary boundaries, can enable a more nuanced understanding of our complex world and thus, hopefully, foster positive change. Today, we will explore the role of faith, examining its journey from scripture to the brutal realities we very tragically witness today. But before we get started, let me say just a few words about our organizations. The De Gruyter Foundation is a not-for-profit organization based in Berlin, dedicated to promoting excellent scholarship, particularly in the humanities. 1014, also a not-for-profit organization, is named after our address at 1014 Fifth Avenue in New York. We strive to encourage transatlantic dialogue on pressing global issues. Both organizations are nonpartisan, and the views expressed during today's conversation are those of our two esteemed experts, Professor Susannah Heschel and Professor Terrence Johnson. Thank you so much to the two of you for joining us today. I also want to express my sincere appreciation to Professor Kacandes, who will be moderating our discussion. Professor Kacandes has curated the entire Humanities for Humans series on behalf of the De Gruyter Foundation and 1014. Additionally, she is the series editor at De Gruyter and serves on the Advisory Council of 1014. And so with this now, I will hand over the floor to Professor Kacandes. Irene, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that welcome and introduction to the series and to today's topics, Dr. Donovan, and a very warm welcome to our online audience, to whom I say good evening, good day, and good morning to you on both sides of the Atlantic and across this large continent. I can ask you to please place any questions you might have into the chat box as they occur to you, and I'll pose as many as we have time for to our experts. So let me introduce those experts who are speaking with us today. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College, where I personally have had the enriching experience of being her colleague. Professor Heschel's scholarship examines Jewish and Protestant religious thought in Germany, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany, and Jüdischer Islam, Islam und jüdisch-deutsche Selbstbestimmung, as well as several edited volumes. Professor Heschel has just finished a book together with Sarah Imhoff, The Woman Question in Jewish Studies, which is forthcoming with Princeton University Press. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and recipient of 5 honorary doctorates, and is leaving in just a few days to teach a 3-week seminar at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. Welcome, Susannah. Professor Terrence L. Johnson is the Charles G. Adams Professor of African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School. He's the author of Blacks and Jews in America, An Invitation to Dialogue, co-written with Jacques Berliner-Blau, and this book won the 2023 Outstanding Book Award from the Association for Ethnic Studies. He's also written We Testify with Our Lives, How Religion Transformed Radical Thought from Black Power to Black Lives Matter, and Tragic Soul Life, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy. Professor Johnson is currently a Stephen M. Poland Fellow in Constitutional Law and History at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, and he is completing a manuscript titled Torn Asunder, Race and Religion in the Shadow of Law and Justice that's forthcoming with Columbia University Press. We're going to put some more information about our experts in the chat, My most hearty welcome to both of you. So I'll get this conversation going by mentioning there are two fairly different motivations I had in planning this session of Humanities for Humans. What people in our audience might not have realized when they registered is that theology and religious studies are important areas of teaching and research in German-speaking countries as well as in North American universities. Perhaps due to the American tradition of separation of church and state, as the expression goes, many Americans, I believe, are not aware of the academic study of theology, religions, and religious history, as opposed to, say, the practice of it or the training of clergy. In Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, furthermore, theologians and professors of religion are part of the cadre of folks I've referred to several times in this series as public intellectuals. They are often interviewed or asked to weigh in on current affairs in all kinds of media. This is not so much the case in the United States. And as a not irrelevant side note, I would just mention that publishing in theology and the study of religion is an important part of many American academic university presses, as well as the Gruyter Brill publishers associated with our sponsor, the Gruyter Foundation. Just to give you a taste and an idea of some topics, in 2024, among many other books, de Gruyter Brill published Oaths and Vows, Words as Genesis, as well as something called The Lost Libraries of Tunis. Many studies are forthcoming in 2025, for example, The End of Time, Constructions of Time in the Apocalyptic Imagination. So to summarize this first motivation, when I thought up this series, I wanted to make sure that at least one session involved professional researchers of religion, like our two guests today. From today's title and its brief description, you will discern more easily my other specific motivation for today's conversation. Religion has been used in this country to justify the genocide of Indigenous Americans, chattel slavery of Africans, the need to cure homosexuality, and even why Trump survived assassination attempts, to name just a few horrendous perversions of religion. Nazism, anti-Semitism, and the Judeocide of mid-20th century in Europe are not our direct concerns today, though they may come up. But obviously, using religion to justify violence is not confined to North America, nor to today's events. I'm grateful to Professors Heschel and Johnson for saying yes to my invitation to discuss biblical promises and their challenges to religious faith and secular societies, a topic we could talk about for hours, if not days. So I'll just mention again for the audience that we're going to start by focusing on connections of Scripture to various communities, but of course we'll go in other directions as well. So, Professor Johnson, I'm hoping you might like to start. And before we do get to violence per se, I was wondering if you could just fill us in a little more about African American Christians and their connection to the Bible, to biblical tropes, to understand themselves, faith, and religion during, after slavery. I know you've worked quite a bit with the Exodus narrative and how the Hebrew prophets have informed African American communities at many different times. So please just take a few minutes to fill us in on some of the general outlines of your research.
Sure. Thank you, Irene. I'm really excited to join my colleague and friend, Susannah Heschel, for this conversation. I like to kind of phrase it maybe in a kind of an anecdote. I remember as a high school kid sitting in the back of my church. I attended a Baptist church in the Midwest, and I was talking to a buddy about what had happened sort of the prior weekend during the sermon, of course, and not really listening, but actually listening while I was talking to him. And at one point, I recall hearing the minister say, women should be quiet, and they really do not have, justification for serving in leadership positions in the church. And I remember pausing and thinking, that just sounds like an odd statement for the minister to make, in part based on my own circumstances in terms of my mom and my grandmother and all the people I knew who were women, who were very active in the church, but also people I assumed and felt were very smart. And that sort of interaction with my pastor and the Bible, in some ways, sort of, I think, sort of stuck to me in very interesting ways. And I would argue, in some ways, really speaks to a broader set of issues in terms of how African Americans, sort of writ large, engage sort of Christianity. And I want to frame it in terms of like we're kind of strange set of creatures in part because of how we were exposed to the Bible in the U.S. And I want to borrow a category that my colleague Michelle Mooney Adams sort of calls internal outsiders. I want to frame sort of African American interactions with the Bible as people who are clearly rooted within many different kinds of Christianities in the US, and yet they are the perennial outsiders. And in many respects, they have been raising a kind of clarion call, right, since enslavement, and raising a call that really argues for this idea of how do we read the text, the truthfulness of this text, right, which has very many different narratives that are complicated, many that affirm enslavement, others that reject it, others that reform all kinds of brutal violence, and yet also there's a lot of hope in the Bible. And how do you make sense of that? And these internal outsiders, in conversation with scholars like Alan Callahan and Vincent Woodbush, argue that they found the Bible to be somewhat very unique, in part because they saw it as a kind of talking book, because they learned the Bible, for many of them, orally. And this book became a kind of an exchange, right? It was clearly, in many respects, viewed as sort of sacred, and yet it was also viewed as a book in which they could actually have a conversation. And so I think that really changes sort of the framework of how Black folk have encountered this book. And the Exodus story is like, again, it's an overly used category that's helpful, but also speaks to some of the challenges, right, of these tropes in the Bible. But what's interesting about the Exodus narrative is that African Americans saw it as sort of a sign of hope, a sign of God's promise to a particular people, and that this promise was eternal. And the argument was, well, if Yahweh can promise freedom for the Israelites, why can't the same freedom happen for Africans in America, in the Americas? And so this became a kind of, I think, really kind of an invaluable kind of hermeneutical exercise for African Americans. This idea that there's a promise within the Bible, a kind of a truthfulness that then we as quote unquote internal outsiders must not only discover, but kind of speak that to the world. And there's also this notion of seeing the Bible as, in some ways, carving out a kind of what I'm calling a religious piety. And this religious piety had everything to do with how do you follow sort of the Gospels? How do you follow the life of this Jesus figure, many of whom considered to come from a lowly lot, and really wanted to show how this sort of quote unquote underside of the tradition really speaks to all the truths of the Bible. And then lastly, we have to understand sort of African American engagement with the Bible in terms of what I call prophetic critics, right? People who recognize the truthfulness of the book, they affirm the truthfulness, and then also are willing then to take that and to use it to speak to the world, to speak to issues that often we are afraid to engage and to encounter. And so I think as a kind of a theoretical sort of framework for understanding how African Americans have approached the Bible, I think internal outsider, this idea of religious piety, and prophetic critics really frame sort of the varying ways African Americans have used the Bible. Again, it's not as a monolith, but as a way to sort of to speak to a kind of internal religious piety and spirituality, as well as speak to the world, a world in which in many cases rendered them, right, as non-human, people without a soul, and people in need of redemption.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderfully helpful start to our conversation. And I'm wondering, for Professor Heschel, do you want to just respond immediately to something that's just been said, or would you like to just fill us in on a very different relationship in some ways that you've had to both the Hebrew Bible and to the Christian scriptures?
Well, thank you. I'll do both.
Great. Perfect.
And I just first want to say it's great to be with you, Terrence. And Irene, you are, without question, the most generous colleague I've ever had, intellectually and personally. Thank you. I would begin by saying that I will speak personally in a moment, but I sometimes ask my students, what did Mary Magdalene do for a living? And of course, they immediately say, well, she was a prostitute. And I said, well, where is that in the scripture? Oh, turns out they don't know because it's not there. So I make that point to show them that we approach scripture with certain ideas in mind that may be drawn from a long tradition of interpretation. we don't come to it as a new work. Even if the students are reading it for the first time, they already know a lot about it, or so they think. And that becomes an issue for us. What kind of interpretive community do we bring when we as individuals read? We are actually part of an interpretive community, whether we realize it or not. And it may be a community, well, for me as a Jew, yes, there's Judaism's interpretations of certain passages in the scripture, but there's also what we call Western civilization, the kinds of things that come up. I'll just give you another example, if I may. I went on a tour of the Whitney Museum with the docent. It's the Museum of American Art in New York. And we came to a picture that was a kind of an Edward Hopper type of picture of an empty kitchen with a table and chairs. And on the chair was draped a raincoat. And no people in the painting. And the docent said, you see that raincoat? That's the shroud of Christ. So I'm very interested in what we bring to scripture. And she said it very sincerely. I understand that, because that is a way of thinking. So what interests me is what we bring when we're reading scripture. And that's why, for example, in my book about the Nazi period, I was interested in how the verse in Galatians 3:28 is read by people who were theologians, Protestant theologians, who supported Hitler. Now we think of Galatians 3:28, Christ there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. That's an inclusive verse. Everybody is equal in Christ. Okay, a good liberal verse. But in fact, for Nazis, it meant something different. It meant that even when you're baptized, you don't lose your gender. You remain a man or a woman. And so too, you remain a Jew. You retain your racial identity. So therefore, a Jew who's been baptized is really not a Christian. That person remains a Jew. And many supporters of Nazism use that verse to justify what they were doing. So I'm interested in the uses of verses and what we bring to them. I want to, though, also just say that for me, growing up as an Orthodox Jew in a very religious home and sent to a very religious Jewish day school, that did not inspire a love of the Bible for me. I would say what inspired a real love of the Bible was hearing Martin Luther King preach. It was a civil rights movement. My father was involved in it, and that made the difference for me. And I would say that the Bible came alive. Moses, Amos, but it was also that this was a movement in which the Bible came to the fore. It was the central text of the civil rights movement. And remember that this was coming not that long after the murder of 6 million Jews in Europe, including my grandmother, 3 aunts, a whole extended family, and so on. My father was a refugee. So I think that really healed our souls as Jews. It made us feel that we didn't have to cover up that we were Jewish, change our names, change our appearance. And that, I think, was a very important gift from Dr. King to the Jews of America. So the Bible, in other words, Irene, as we've just talked, the Bible can be used in so many different ways, what we bring to it, but also, in this case, what it gives to us. Touched my heart. It made me want to devote my life to the study of religion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. That's also very powerful. Terrence, did you want to just respond immediately to? Yeah.
No, I mean, Susannah's characterization is actually beautiful, and it really reminded me of this idea that often we see the academy and our lives are so distinct and separate, but this idea that we all have a kind of interpretive baggage, we all have interpretive histories that we bring to the text, right? Whether we're sitting down at dinner, kind of reflecting on sort of the sermon or reflecting on, questions around identity and gender, right? And scripture. I tell my students all the time, we are actually very critical readers when we think about how we grew up often, that we bring that to us. And now in the academic world, we're basically trying to give language to a lot of these ongoing questions, right? That force us not only to recognize sort of the importance of our starting point, but then also then to figure out how does our starting point, say, relate to, as Susannah mentioned, the very history of how we write into texts, right? And then create these traditions around oppression. That's the first point. And the second point I want to add is that, this idea that the Bible becomes alive for Susannah because of King, in so many respects, I think we often forget that for many African Americans, this idea of reading the Bible was not simply reading this past text, right? It was about how do you actually convince the people that you actually believe that Moses parted the Red Sea, right? So the preacher has to embody, right, the very characters that he or she or they are actually engaging, and then affirm the community with that narrative. And then as you engage the community with that narrative, the question is, how then do you not only show your love for that community, but then how then do you actually push them? Because you're always trying to like push beyond what we know. And I think about Du Bois's double consciousness, right? This idea that one is always sort of teetering back and forth in terms of how we interpret the world. And it's never to end up in your comfort zone, but that your reading of the text should often push us, right, to what he calls a truer self. This idea of how do we actually come up with a broader conception of who we are as human beings, who we are as a particular kind of tribe of people. How do we broaden that to have this kind of these rich conversations, to recognize, right, I think the beauty that these narratives bring to our lives and to our academic lives in particular.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to head into very tough waters immediately, because obviously, as Susannah's brief reference to the Nazis' reading of that Galatians verse shows us, there can be used the Bible not for self-affirmation or not for positive construction of community, but also for exclusion of other communities, and indeed for violence, to justify violence against other communities. So when we decided, and that was really a joint decision of the three of us to give the title we did, we used the word challenges, right? And I'm just wondering if each of you might be able to share a time in history or another particular verse or passage or biblical understanding that actually was being used to justify horrible violence against communities. I know that could seem obvious to both of you, but it might help anchor the audience and me to share some other examples of that. Susannah, is there one that pops up for you? I know you've studied so carefully not only the Hebrew Bible itself, but also the rabbinic traditions around the Hebrew Bible. And I'm just wondering if some of those controversies had lasting, or I shouldn't say controversies necessarily, but discrepancies had long-lasting life, let's put it that way, or led to action.
Yes, well, I think exactly the question that you've just posed is exactly the tradition of Judaism in its confrontation with the Bible, because from the very beginning, from the outset, we see even within the Bible itself, but certainly in the post-biblical, what's called the rabbinic tradition, passages in the Bible were very disturbing and had to be reinterpreted, if not gotten rid of. One of the things is, for example, death penalty. The rabbi said, no death penalty. They didn't say, well, this is a mistake in the Bible, or God got it wrong, or something like that. They just made it impossible to actually come up with the death penalty. Or, for instance, eye for an eye. Where does that come from? Everybody talks about it. Well, in the ancient Near East, if you were rich, you got one punishment. If you were poor, you got a different one, which is not so different from our situation in the United States right now. And so the Bible comes and says, no, you don't punish the person, you punish for the crime. It has to be an equality. If somebody puts out your eye, you put out their eye. But you don't say, well, he put out my eye, but he's so rich, he doesn't get punished. Something like that. But the rabbis came along and said, no, that's no good. I mean, what if I'm a one-eyed person and I put out someone's eye, and then you take out my eye, then I'm completely blind. Well, the person I injured isn't completely blind. So there is no, so sometimes looking for equivalence doesn't work. And anyway, what good does it do anybody if you punish the person who committed the crime rather than compensate the person who's been injured? Doesn't that make more sense? So in other words, I'm simply trying to say that sometimes these passages that all of us find disturbing in the Bible, that's a long tradition of finding those verses disturbing. To find them disturbing, to reinterpret, to say this is not acceptable, we have to rethink this. That's exactly what religion does.
Mm-hmm. Terrence?
No, as I mentioned earlier, I think the letter to Corinth is, I think, is a really great example in terms of Paul's admonishment of women to remain silent. And I remember in grad school, Karen King introduced us to, I think it's Annette Clark Wire, her book on Corinthians and the rhetorical use of language and debates. And I often wonder, what if we as religious persons, right, as we're engaging these texts and texts that we find questionable, say around gender, in this case, in terms of women's silence, what if we knew that there was like several debates that Paul had to encounter before he wrote this letter to Corinth, that he was trying to understand this idea of what do we do with women who are laying of hands, who are prophesying, who are doing all the things that the way, meaning Jesus, said to do. And then you have a group of men who are disgruntled, that they feel as if, well, all these prophecies, all the laying of hands is too chaotic. We can't keep it structured, and we're losing power. And what if we, again, found evidence to suggest that Paul says, well, what do I do? Right? Both in some ways bring interesting and potentially legitimate arguments. What if we then understand that what Paul says, look, in order to save and to build an institution, I'd rather silence the women temporarily so that we can have an institution that can replicate itself. And my argument is that, well, whether we agree with that or not, I think the additional information forces us to pause whenever we read a text. And my argument in terms of, as we think about hermeneutics, right, and think about how do we engage sacred texts, is we should always pause to understand the sort of historical context of the debate, of the text at hand, and also then pause in terms of the kind of theological claims we want to make from that text. And know that every time we want to use something to justify a claim, are we asking ourselves, well, who's not present? Who's not present, or who is present but invisible in this conversation? And are we giving an account for that when I give my sermon, when I teach Sunday school, when I teach, Hebrew day school? Am I giving an account to the people who are there but not visible to the natural eye, to the reader?
I think one thing that's beautiful about the examples each of you just gave, and that I want to tie that because this has been a whole series of conversations. You are the 8th of these conversations. And over and over again, we've come to a point of saying, we can't do it without history, right? It doesn't work. If we're completely ignorant of history, there are going to be all kinds of catastrophic consequences of that. And I think you both have given some examples. So what do you think is the answer to people who are, who say, well, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, or who want to use eye for an eye to punish in awful ways those they consider who have violated them. What are some of the steps we could take as society as a whole? And maybe I'll get very personal for a moment, which is just to say, I consider myself someone who's trying to be a Christian, a good Christian. And I hear this word Christian used all the time in American culture right now. And I don't recognize anything of what's the context or the content of what's being said as Christian, right? And I feel kind of helpless when people, just to give a very recent example, when people say, well, the fact that Trump survived the assassination attempt must mean that he is the appointed of God, right? I mean, that for me, I just throw up my hands. But both of you have been in positions in the classroom and in public speaking where you can't just throw up your hands. What do you do when people try to use religion to justify things that maybe are not justifiable otherwise? Either of you can answer, but Susannah, do you want to take that on first, or you could reframe the question if you prefer to?
I share the problem. I would say, first of all, that there are also Jews who use the Bible to make certain kinds of claims that I consider racist, violent, and destructive. So we're in the same boat, Irene, and I ask myself, that's not Judaism. What are they saying? What are they doing? I would say, first, I heard somebody recently, somebody said to me, the Israeli Jews who were murdered on October 7th by Hamas were not religious, so it was therefore God's punishment. Now, I find comments like that, you hear such things whenever there's horrific assault that people can't explain. I hear this kind of thing. It's primitive thinking. It's unethical thinking. It lacks any human sensibility, and it is theologically deeply mistaken. I would point, for example, just as one quick example, to a passage in rabbinic literature in which God repents. That is the sun and the moon. The sun has such a bright light, and the moon has such a small light. And the moon complains to God, why did you make the sun so big and me so small? And the sun illuminates the whole world for so many hours, and what am I as a moon? And they go back and forth, and God tries to explain, well, you have a role as well, moon. And yet at the end, there is no explanation. And God says, you're right, and I have to repent. There are moments like this when God also repents sometimes in anger for having even created human beings. After all, that's how the book of Genesis opens, with one brother killing another. So I would say for people who speak in this way and look for this kind of a justification, there's a deep flaw in their religious thinking. We need to clarify that for them. We need to clarify that we have, as human beings, profound responsibility given to us by God, and we need to shoulder that responsibility. And for us to say, oh, that is God's decision, is to abdicate precisely the mandate we've been given by virtue of having been created in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And I thank you for that very much. And I would just point out one other example of what you're saying, which was when 9/11 happened, there were certain communities who said, oh, those were homosexuals who worked there. Those were, people who were making profit. That was God's punishment for liberal American society. So I think it's a similar example of a perversion. Terrence, what comes to mind for you in this context?
It's such a just very difficult, I think, topic to engage, in part because I'm thinking of some of the conversations I've had with friends who are religiously conservative, who are Christian conservatives. There are a certain group of people we used to call sort of sanctified within Black communities, people who are holiness. And, recently saw a friend send a clip of a minister saying, look, I don't recognize the Christianity of today, right? I see men dressed as women, I'm quoting here, in the church, and vice versa, right? I see all kind of disarray. And I've been trying to figure out how do we respond, right, to people with these very radically different views of the Bible, right, and radically different conceptions of the world vis-a-vis Christianity. And I struggle in part because, my heart wants to say we have to sort of listen, even if we disagree. And I know that sounds like a very trite way of saying it, but let me go to something very specific. As I was preparing for this talk, I went back and looked at Beyond Vietnam, King's speech in '67, A Time to Break Silence. And I didn't know this, but apparently, I believe he asked Rabbi Heschel to accompany him to this event, and Heschel was there to support him. And in the speech,
introduced him that night. My father introduced him, and I was there that night too, by the way.
Oh my goodness!
I would just mention super quickly for some in our audience who might not realize that Abraham Joshua Heschel is Susannah's father. So that's who they're both speaking of right now. Yes, please continue, Terrence.
No, and so King is talking about how do we engage? How the difficulty of condemning one's own nation, right? And he's speaking to America, and he has this interesting quote. He says, "Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence when it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weakness of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition." And so when I hear comments that I may disagree with theologically, I want to call Beck and King for help and say, look, how do we begin to hear these concerns, right, that many say are justified? Even, Supreme Court Justice Alito referenced this idea that it's hard to speak about marriage because you're condemned if you don't speak of it in only one way in terms of heterosexuality. And I think as professors, but also as people of goodwill, people who believe in terms of the Quaker tradition that God resides in all of us, we have to hold these people, hold their concerns, and then I think engage them in ways that bring in additional evidence, but also acknowledge that we hear your complaint, we hear your citation. Now let us introduce competing things, not so you can actually believe what I say, but to complicate what you are saying. And in some ways, we want to bring additional evidence to slow people down as they're making these broad claims. And I think this idea of acknowledging so-called enemy's point of view, which again, that's a very charged kind of language that King is introducing, but to acknowledge what they're saying, it's okay, now let me engage you with my different reasons. I think it will force us to have a different kind of notion of what does deliberation look like in this country, right? And around the world. And this whole idea that, again, more examples should slow us down and to give us pause before we make these broad sweeping claims.
So just bringing to this audience today and to the two of you a very powerful lesson from our last Humanities for Humans on turning controversy into connection. There was precisely that idea of listening that you both mentioned, also of curiosity, trying to ask questions about what the opponent or possible enemy is saying. And finding ultimately things that you have in common. And so, Susannah, if it's okay, I would just draw on a relatively recent experience just about a year ago when on the very vicious attack of Hamas on Israelis happened on October 7th. You and your colleagues in Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth College anticipated some of the things that Terrence was just talking about. You anticipated the heightening of emotions, the grasping at things that people were sure they knew or truths that they were going to draw on to create a different kind of atmosphere. Could you fill our audience in a little bit on what happened in the wake of October 7th on the Dartmouth College campus?
Yes, so first, I would say that we've been working together as faculty in Jewish Studies and Middle Eastern Studies for several years to create a close working relationship. We co-sponsor lectures, cross-list courses, and in some cases co-teach certain classes. So we had a good relationship. And as soon as the attack happened, my colleague, who's chair of Middle Eastern Studies, Tariq El-Aris, phoned me. He was in Cairo at the moment, and his voice sounded the way I felt. So he couldn't come in, but I organized 2 faculty forums with 3 other colleagues at Dartmouth for Middle Eastern Studies. We opened it to the entire campus, mostly students who came, hundreds and hundreds, and we had a live stream. But what we wanted to do was to give the students an opportunity to ask questions, to talk about their feelings, and also to demonstrate to the students how we, as faculty at an academic institution, talk to one another after a horrific episode like this. So we speak to each other in a certain way that I think the students understood. When we speak to each other in an academic context, in a university, it's not the same as talking in a restaurant, in someone's home. It's a different kind of relationship, a different tone of voice. So we speak to each other with great respect and with dignity. We answered student questions, some of which were sharp, pointed, but which were posed also in a dignified, respectful way. And that's what we wanted to demonstrate to the students, to give them that example. I think there's a question here about listening. How do we listen to one another, especially in moments like this? What we've found is that when we co-teach a class, we co-teach, by the way, not because we disagree with each other. That's not the point. We come with different training. My training is in Jewish studies and the study of religion. I'm with a colleague who may be in Arabic literature or in history or political science. But the students see how we relate to each other and they imitate it. They create a classroom and they speak to one another in a similar tone, wanting to learn from each other. So we have students that one student may be Palestinian and others an Orthodox Jew. We have right wing, left wing, but they smile at each other and they respect each other. We don't have fights in the classroom. We have questions and we push them to think about the future, not just about the past. We want to understand the past, but not stop with being embroiled in a litigation of the past. So how do we listen? And I'll just say a word about what religion has to contribute. I'm not Catholic, but I would assume that when a Catholic goes to confession, the priest listens in a way that is very different from the way you might listen in a conversation around a table. There's a certain kind of listening, and you can feel it. You know how you're being listened to. There's a teaching in Hasidism, a pietist Jewish religious movement. And then from the 19th century, it's a question of how does the rabbi, called Rebbe, listen when someone comes and pours out his or her heart in agony with troubles and sorrows. Well, there are many teachings about that. The Rebbe is supposed to feel what the person is feeling. If the person is depressed, the Rebbe is supposed to feel the depression, descend into that state of depression to help lift the person up. So I think we all know what it means to be listened to in that way, or not listened to in that way. We long to be listened to like that, and we should try to listen ourselves to other people in that way, with a heart, trying to feel what they are feeling. And so in this time of polarization in this country and all over the world, we hope the dialogue can help overcome that. Dialogue that does involve this kind of listening. So that's what we are trying to accomplish at Dartmouth.
Thanks so much for that. Terrence, I think it was a little different on the Harvard campus. Do you have a take on maybe what worked and what didn't work? I know there was a situation, for example, where images of hostages were taken down. That's one of the few details I've retained. What would you like to share about that experience?
Well, as my grandmother would say, I think the good Lord protected me. I was not on campus last year. I was on sabbatical. And so everything I read about, everything I know about what happened, I read, like everyone else. But what I'll say is I'll take, I agree with Susannah, and I'll just say I'll take it from a slightly different point of view, in that I want to make sure that as we are sort of engaging our students, that we don't allow sort of rhetoric and also the kind of the cry of pain distort or even sort of change sort of the classroom setting. By that I mean, a couple of years ago, I had a student talking about an issue, and I just felt her tone was just inappropriate. I really was like, whoa, she's really coming after me in a really harsh way. And I was so excited to go back home and write an email saying, you were inappropriate in the classroom. And as I kind of reflected on the exchange and tried to really understand why was she so painful or so hurt, what I discovered is that I had a particular bias, right? I was accustomed to people negotiating these public spaces in a way in which people felt comfortable, right? In a very kind of, one colleague would call it a very kind of sort of middle class, respectable environment where people come, you disagree, and you go back and forth, and you go out for lunch or coffee. And this woman did not come from, or had not quote unquote been trained in the kind of middle class ideology. And not to say either one is correct or not, but what I realize is that we also have to be attuned to the circumstances out of which people are speaking, and to try to then hear what they're saying, even if it's like reading to us, even if it's like, taking your nails to a chalkboard, and then engage them as they are. And my fear, again, as someone who's reading and trying to understand what happened last year, now that I'm back on campus, is my fear is that I don't know if anyone feels heard, right? And I'm not necessarily interested in coming to a common ground, but I am interested in this idea, how do we then use these ongoing differences and sit on the edge of those differences and kind of keep engaging, keep going back and forth? Because if we don't sit on the edge of those differences, we're just simply going to put a blanket over the issue. And in 20 years, another group will surface, right? This idea that we don't understand pain from different contexts, I think is pretty troubling, right? This idea that we try to privilege one group over another, again, it's again problematic, but there's a history behind it, right? There's a history in terms of we have produced a generation of people, right, who assume that their starting point is the only starting point, and that one goes to college, right, for affirmation, right? We come basically to, this is another step in becoming professionalized. And I would argue that there are different models of higher education. And I'm trying to push this idea, well, what does it mean to come here and assume that your starting point is not the only starting point? And that in fact, your starting point might need some modification, and that it might need some kind of pushing, right? This idea that You actually come so that you actually can see some growth. I think while that sounds very basic and trite, it's very difficult to engage students who come here who've had tutors their whole lives, right? Who assume that this is simply another step in a trajectory toward one end goal. And I think we need to problematize that goal. And I think we see that in terms of how people are fighting each other. It's like they have these siloed positions, and clearly it's very complicated. I want to acknowledge that. And yet I wonder if people make the assumption that, well, actually, I'm here for kind of relearning. Doesn't mean I'm going to abandon what I knew when I came, but I'm here for relearning. I think that relearning, again, might trigger something, might trigger a kind of open. It doesn't mean we're going to have a kumbaya moment, but trigger an opening. That King talks about this idea that we come with humility. He says, knowing the limited notion of our vision, that our visions are all limited. And yet we have a moral conscience that we're trying to engage, right? And to make it come alive. And he says, well, with our limited understanding that we have a limited view, with the moral conscience, now we bring in history. And how then do these three things sort of collide, right? Interrogate each other. And then how do we then pick up the debris from that engagement?
Well, I think the two of you must be wonderful teachers and good listeners, and you've cited some examples of amazing listeners and people who were individuals of faith. What happens when the folks at the top don't want to do any listening themselves, when they are sure that they are holding the only correct position? It seems to me like that filters down to the whole society, and that the polarization we're feeling in America today, the polarization that's gone on in Israeli society, the polarization that's gone on in Eastern Europe. I am not as educated in the polarization that's been going on in the Sudan, but obviously there we have a major conflict there, one of the largest actually in terms of numbers of refugees. So what happens when the folks at the top have no will to listen or no will to even consider that maybe they don't have the full story? Can religion help us at all with that? Can the scriptures help us? Are there passages we should be thinking about that maybe many of us are not thinking about that could help? Susannah, you want to jump in?
Well, I would say first, in terms of teaching, I agree with Terrence and what he said about students coming to study. And one of my concerns is, in a way, there's something fragile often about students who are at a college as undergraduates, making a transition from being kids to being adults, from being in many ways free from various responsibilities to being burdened with responsibilities. So I see that as these 4 undergraduate years as a fragile period. And I also feel that my role as a professor is to help them find their own self-understanding and not to impose. So I never tell my students what I think politically. I tell them, on the contrary, I have great friends and even relatives who are very, very right-wing and very, very left-wing. And I actually like both of them, both ends of the spectrum, let's say. I listen to them, I learn something. There's sometimes I agree with certain things they say, as well as disagree. So come and talk to me, I tell the students. Tell me what you think. Let's discuss. I want to hear. And they come and we talk, and I ask questions, hopefully to help them sharpen their own thinking in a critical way, self-critical way. I am concerned about colleagues who do come into the classroom and denounce this or that political figure, whatever, episode, so on, and then tell us, what do you think? That's a kind of, in a way, it has a tinge of harassment. What is this poor student supposed to say? I want to do well in the course. I want the professor to like me. I don't agree. Should I speak up or should I be quiet? So we have to navigate these things carefully. We also have to recognize that students now come from all over the world. I have students who've never heard of the Bible or God or Jesus or Moses. So what then is the foundation for our coming together in the classroom? What is that? it's not sort of the Western canon, Western civilization. We should think about that. Are there certain human qualities, certain human values that we share that become, in a sense, the points of reference for all of us together in the classroom, regardless of where we grew up? Those are the kinds of questions that concern me. And in terms of biblical verses,
well, not necessarily verses, but I mean, is it right to look at either to study religion because one hopes to make progress in these areas, or if one is considering oneself as a person of a particular faith, are there ways in which we should be asking certain questions of the religions that are out there or the religions we think we belong to that can help us deal with these polarized times? Because I think we would all agree that we are living in very polarized times of strong opinions where people don't necessarily want to hear what the other side is saying.
I would say that, I don't like to create fine lines, but, so the academic study of religion, right, clearly has drawn certain lines in terms of academics versus practitioners. And I think those lines get blurred all the time. But I do think what's helpful about the academic study of religion is that I believe we have done an incredible job, right, of trying to bring in sort of a multidisciplinary approach to how do we study ongoing questions around human existence, ongoing questions, right, around something like what we call like an object, right, and how an object or totem relates into human experience, how it relates to our understanding of so-called sacred versus the profane. So I do think there are ways in which the academic study of religion allows us sort of to classify and have a kind of clearer language around understanding a certain kind of religious literacy in public life. And yet that can't be the only sort of set of tools that we use to engage people who see this as a part of their whole embodiment, as a part of their life. And there must be a way for us to engage each other. And at the same time, I would say, often religion gets marginalized in the academy because the assumption is, oh, you're just studying something that doesn't really exist, right? And in fact, we're bringing in all kinds of tools to help answer questions that political scientists often forget about, or neuroscientists forget about, in terms of how we're thinking about the ways in which, right, the mind can help heal the body in terms of, effectiveness for prayer, for example, that we are all aware of. And so I don't want to argue that religion can heal the world, but I think studying religion can give us, I think, a broad set of vocabularies, a broad set of tools, right, to engage with leaders, with people who actually see religion as sort of margin, right? Even though we know it's deeply personal for many people, I would say many of our leaders just discount it. And I think if we had a better sense of how religion is operating in people's lives, we can actually come in and address certain issues, right? And really pinpoint this idea of, well, why do you think one figure can save your community? Why do you think God only chooses one person, right? Mm-hmm. When in fact, we have a set of stories in which, oh, there are many people who have chosen. Or what do we do with Hagar? This idea that, Hagar is abandoned, is pushed out into the wilderness, and yet somehow God says, oh, from your son Ishmael will come a great nation. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean about religious diversity? Does it mean as Christians, do we accept Muslims as our real brothers? Are they saved? I mean, I think, again, these narratives are not necessarily designed for one answer in particular, but I think that they're designed to give us questions to then open up and push us in terms of our own set of internal beliefs and traditions.
Well, Terrence, you get my job in the future because you've just made a wonderful justification for humanities approaches to questions and knowledge. I knew this would go by fast, but it's gone by even faster than I expected. And I want to give you each a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, we don't have too much more than that, just to bring up any topic whatsoever that we didn't get to that you were hoping we would get to, obviously doing it very briefly. But Susannah, you and I have had the good fortune of having taken up so many different subjects. Is there one in particular that you'd like to throw out there, at least for our audience to think about before we have to close down this conversation?
Well, I would just say that this very conversation itself illustrates something important. In the middle of the 19th century, Protestant theologians said theology is about the historical reconstruction of the origins of Christianity. So the distinction actually between theology and the study of religion became blurred. And it was all about history. And what did history mean? It meant look for which text influenced that text, which was earlier, which was later, one to the other. I think what we're seeing today is a very different kind of approach, which is to say, not looking so much for one text being the original and the next one is belated, but rather for seeing a dynamic that was taking place in the first few centuries in which Christians and Jews didn't have strict boundaries, but were having conversations. And Islam came in as part of the outgrowth of that conversation. Is there one God? What does that mean? What does it mean for us ethically? And so on. These are ongoing influences, back and forth conversations. So I think this very discussion that we've had for the past hour is illustrative of precisely this new spirit in the study of religion and also in the way theologians themselves think about religion. So I thank you, Irene, and I thank the Gruyter and the 1014 Foundation.
Thank you. Terrence?
I would just add, when we think about, say, Puritanism in America, this idea that John Winthrop talks about, the idea of a city on a hill that Ronald Reagan then uses in 1989, right? In some ways is so, I think, representative of how religion has always been so present in terms of, the American project, and yet also so marginal. And again, I always like to think this idea, can we bring in more evidence, right, to then complicate the narrative we're giving? And if we knew if the so-called founding fathers were engaging the Quran as they were thinking about, shipment in the Mediterranean area, and this idea that wanting to figure out who are these people they're engaging, and what does it mean that people are reading translations of the Quran, and how does that then shape how they understand human existence and social ordering? And so we have a complicated history with religion, and I just want us to sit with the complication. And what does it mean to be a city of the hill in a moment when many people are saying we need to pull back from the world and not shine a light on the world? So, city of the hill can be a very complicated and messy sort of template, as it were. And yet it's always something that I think challenges us in terms of forcing us out of our comfort zone and forcing us to engage a broader set of questions.
Mm-hmm. So I want to thank the two of you very, very much for urging us to learn more history, urging us to ask more questions, urging us to sit with complication, urging us to ask people questions about why they think that this leader or this approach is the only approach. I think this could be helpful to many of us at this time when we're all quaking in our shoes about what's next post beginning of November. I will share with our audience, in addition to my very great thanks to the two of you, that we actually have a book that will be appearing with essays by some of the participants in the first two seasons of Humanities for Humans. It'll be coming out with De Gruyter Brill, that's been mentioned several times, in early January, called Humanities for Humans, Clear Thinking on Challenging Issues. So you see the connection to what we've been talking about today. And since I'm noticing that we have 2 minutes left, and every minute is valuable to me and to the audience, any chance you can give us a real quick definition of Christian nationalism, Terrence, and any chance, Susannah, you can give us a quick definition of Messianic nationalism, because those terms have been thrown around so much. So Terrence, you're up first this time. Just
very quickly. And again, depending on the historian, but this idea of using Christian language, right, to in some ways infiltrate national governance and to make policies that affirm Christianity over and against other traditions.
Okay, and a certain kind of Christianity, because that's not the Christianity I recognize that wants to do that. So thank you for that. Susannah, yes. What is that Messianic nationalism?
Messianic nationalism in Judaism is a heretical movement. It's very clear that God will send a Messiah for redemption when God decides to do that, and that we are obligated as human beings, and this is stated very clearly in Judaism, not to try to hasten the coming of the Messiah, but leave it to God. There has been, in the last 50 years, among some Jews, a heretical movement that says, indeed, we have to hasten that coming of the Messiah, and we do so by occupying territory and land that's mentioned in the Bible and so forth. I think we all are familiar with that. It's a heretical movement. I want to say it for a third time. This goes against very explicit statements in Jewish religious texts.
Mhm. So we're going to end with heretical movements. And I am so grateful to the two of you. Thank you to our audience. Good evening, good day. Have a good rest of your morning, depending on where you're listening to us. And thank you both very, very much. I'll be signing off for all of us now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.